Because some records were never meant to be read by living eyes. Not burned, not lost in courthouse fires, not erased by time. They were preserved, preserved so perfectly that no one would ever question them, until someone finally did. Imagine opening an old county ledger, dust rising from pages older than your grandfather's grandfather, the ink faded but legible, the handwriting neat, methodical, obedient to law. Page after page of birth records, children entering the world, names of mothers, fathers, dates, places, routine, normal, safe. But then your eyes catch something your brain refuses to accept at first. The witness. Every birth has one, someone present when life begins. And there it is again, the same name. You turn the page, there it is again, and again, and again. 100 entries, 200, 300, 42 years of births, different families, different towns, different midwives, different winters and summers. But the witness line never changes. The same woman, the same name, written in the same careful hand, year after year after year. Now, imagine the moment when realization finally hits the man reading those pages, because the clerk who discovered it in 1879 did something simple, something ordinary. He counted 67 births witnessed by the same person, then 80, then over 100, and when he reached the oldest page, the name was already there, which meant something terrifying. This woman had been present at births across the county for decades, but no one remembered her aging, no one remembered her dying, and the deeper the clerk dug, the stranger the pattern became. Because people in the county had heard the name, they knew it, but every time he asked about her, they hesitated, just long enough for fear to show. Then they said the same thing, "I don't know who that is." Not one explanation, not one obituary, not one grave, just a name appearing in birth records for 42 consecutive years. And if you think this is just a strange historical curiosity, then you haven't looked closely enough at how power really moves through the world. Because the truth hidden in those records was never about a midwife. It was about control, about secrets passed through generations, about a system older than the courthouse itself, a system designed to make sure certain truths never entered the official record. And once you see how it worked, you start to understand something unsettling about history. The documents we trust the most are often the most carefully manipulated. But the real danger wasn't the name. The real danger was what that name was protecting. The mountains of Western Virginia have a way of swallowing history. Not destroying it, just hiding it. If you've never stood in the Appalachian Hills at dusk, you might not understand what that means. The light disappears faster there. Valleys fill with shadow while the ridges still burn gold in the dying sun. Distance plays tricks on your eyes. Sound travels strangely, and the past lingers. Communities in those hills during the 1800s weren't like the polished plantation towns you see in textbooks. These were isolated settlements, 200 souls at most, scattered along creeks and dirt paths carved by wagons and weather. People survived through cooperation, but trust? Trust was rare. You earned it across generations. A man might lend you seed corn during a bad spring, but still refuse to tell you what happened on the far side of the ridge 20 years earlier. And there were always things people didn't talk about. Every community has them. Stories that stop mid-sentence when a stranger walks in the room. Names that make old men stare at the floor. The county where the records were discovered, Aldermore County, long erased from modern maps, was exactly that kind of place. The county seat was a settlement called Greer's Mill, a courthouse, a blacksmith, a general store, two churches that had been quietly competing for souls since before the Civil War. That was the entire center of civilization for miles in any direction. Outside that small cluster of buildings stretched miles of forest, creeks, ridges, and scattered farms. Most families only rode into town a few times a year to buy supplies, to settle disputes, to register births and deaths in the courthouse ledger. That ledger was the county's memory, and for 43 years one man had been responsible for writing that memory down. His name was Howard Cutter, a quiet, disciplined clerk who served from 1836 until his death in 1879. People described him the same way every time: meticulous, honest, predictable. The kind of man who never misplaced a document and never missed a Sunday service. For 43 years he recorded every birth brought to the courthouse, child's name, parents, date, location, attending midwife, and finally, witness, the person present when the child entered the world. Most witnesses appeared once or twice: a neighbor, a relative, occasionally a midwife who worked a nearby valley. But hidden among those thousands of names, Cutter kept writing the same one, again and again and again: Nora Vance. At first glance, it looked ordinary. A traveling midwife, maybe, someone who helped with difficult births. But when the new clerk, George Harwick, started reviewing the records after Cutter's death, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The births weren't clustered in one place. They were everywhere. Northern farms, southern hollows, ridge settlements separated by miles of brutal terrain. Some of them occurred only days apart, distances that would take a full day on horseback to travel. Yet somehow the same witness appeared at both. And the deeper Harwick looked, the less possible it seemed. Because midwives don't appear in dozens of births across an entire county for 40 years, not without people remembering them, not without someone saying, "Oh, yes, Nora, she lived over by the creek." But when Harwick asked the town, no one could tell him where she lived. No one could tell him when she died. And the older residents did something even stranger. Before denying they knew her, they paused, just for a moment. The kind of pause people make when deciding whether the truth is dangerous. That pause told Harwick something important. The county hadn't forgotten Nora Vance. They had agreed not to remember her.
George Harwick was not a man who believed in ghosts. That detail matters, because the mind will reach for superstition when facts stop making sense. But Harwick had been educated in the eastern part of the state, where young men were taught the clean logic of Enlightenment thinking. Records meant order, ledgers meant truth. Numbers didn't lie. People did. So when he saw the name repeating through the birth ledger like a pulse running through the county's history, he didn't assume anything supernatural. He assumed there was a trick, some clerical habit, some explanation rooted in human behavior, something practical. And practical men do the same thing when confronted with a mystery. They start asking questions. At first, Harwick asked casually, the way someone brings up a name during normal conversation: a farmer paying a land tax, a widow registering a deed, a merchant filing a supply receipt. Ever heard of a woman named Nora Vance? Most people answered quickly, no. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was what happened before they said it, because Harwick was the kind of observer who noticed small things. And over the weeks that followed, a pattern emerged. Some people answered too quickly, others waited half a second too long, and a few did something he would later write about in his private journal.
Their eyes shifted, not toward him, but toward the door, as if checking whether someone else might hear the conversation. Fear is rarely loud. In small communities, it shows itself through silence, through subjects that vanish the moment they appear. And Harwick began noticing that every time the name Nora Vance entered a conversation, something inside the room changed. Not panic, not outrage, just stillness, as if everyone present had quietly agreed that this subject belonged to the past, and the past was not meant to be reopened. But Harwick kept asking. Eventually, his questions reached the oldest residents in the county, men who had lived long enough that consequences didn't scare them anymore. One of them was an elderly farmer named Rufus Dent. Dent was nearly 80. His memory wandered sometimes, but certain things remained crystal clear. When Harwick asked him about Nora Vance, the old man didn't immediately deny knowing her. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, and for a long moment he simply stared at the courthouse floor. Then he said something that shifted the entire investigation. "I remember her." Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Dent said that when he was a boy, sometime around 1813 or 1814, there had been a woman who traveled through the county during difficult births. She wasn't officially trained, not a midwife in the usual sense, but people called for her anyway, especially when something went wrong, when labor lasted too long, when the child was turned the wrong way, when a mother was slipping away. That was when someone would ride into the hills and find her, the Vance woman. Dent said he saw her once when his own mother was in labor. He remembered something strange about her hands, not their appearance, their feeling. Even as a child, he felt uneasy standing near them, like the air itself changed around her. But the detail that stayed with him the most was her age. Harwick asked him how old she looked. Dent thought about it carefully. 40, maybe, he said. Could have been 50. Then he added something that made Harwick stop writing. "I saw her again 30 years later." Harwick looked up. "You said you only saw her once?" Dent didn't blink. "I thought that too," the old man said quietly. Then he leaned forward. "And she hadn't aged a day." Men who work with records eventually learn a dangerous truth. Paper remembers things that people decide to forget. George Harwick understood that better with every passing week, because the more people denied knowing Nora Vance, the more the ledgers insisted she existed. Ink doesn't hesitate. Ink doesn't pause before answering a question. And the county records were beginning to say something impossible. Harwick began copying the entries into his own notebook. Dates, locations, families, distances between farms. At first, he did this simply to organize the information. But as the map on his office wall slowly filled with marks, something else became visible. Something far more unsettling. Nora Vance appeared everywhere. North of the river, south of the ridge, farms separated by 20 miles of broken mountain road, births only days apart. Anyone who has spent time in the hill country knows what that means. Those distances aren't measured by miles, they're measured by time. Travel in those mountains during the 1840s was brutal, slow, sometimes impossible. Even healthy men on horseback needed hours to move between settlements. A midwife, someone summoned to attend laboring mothers, could not move like that. She would stay within a narrow circle of farms, 10 miles at most. Yet the records showed Nora Vance appearing in places that would require her to cross the county in a single night, over and over again, for decades. Harwick checked the dates again. He reread the ledger twice, then a third time. The entries were clear. One week she appeared at a farm along Spruce Creek. 6 days later, she was listed at a birth nearly 25 miles away. 3 days after that, another farm in the opposite direction. And the handwriting told its own quiet story. The name was always written by Howard Cutter, the long-serving county clerk, a man known for two qualities: precision and honesty. Cutter had held the position for 43 years, 4 decades of meticulous record-keeping. People trusted his ledgers the way sailors trust a compass, which meant something disturbing. If Nora Vance was written into those records, Cutter believed she had been there. Not rumor, not folklore, witness. Harwick decided he needed another perspective, so he visited the only physician in the county, a cautious man named Dr. Alton Prewitt. Prewitt had been practicing in the region since 1857 and had seen more births than anyone else alive in Greer's Mill. Harwick laid the ledger on the doctor's desk. He pointed to the name, then another, and another. Prewitt listened without interrupting. A physician's face is trained to remain neutral. But after several minutes of silence, the doctor leaned back slowly in his chair. "There are 2 possibilities," he said. Harwick waited. "The first," Prewitt continued, "is that there was more than one woman named Nora Vance, a family name passed through generations, mother to daughter, daughter to granddaughter. It was plausible, names repeated in rural communities all the time." But Harwick shook his head. "The handwriting never changes," he said. The clerk believed it was one person. The doctor considered that. Then he spoke the second possibility, and the room seemed to grow colder. "Then your predecessor knew exactly what he was doing." Harwick frowned. "You think Cutter falsified the records?" "No," Prewitt said. "I think he was protecting something." That word lingered in the air between them. Protecting. Not hiding a crime, not covering a mistake, something more deliberate, something maintained carefully across decades. Prewitt folded his hands on the desk. He said, "Arrangements exist in small communities," he said slowly. "Agreements that never reach the courthouse." Harwick felt a slow tightening in his chest. "Between who?" he asked. The doctor held his gaze. "Between the people who know the truth and the people who cannot afford for that truth to become public." Harwick looked down at the ledger again, at the repeating name, Nora Vance, and for the first time the possibility entered his mind that this woman's presence in the records wasn't accidental. It was intentional, a signal, a marker, a quiet reminder to anyone who understood the system that another ledger existed somewhere, one the courthouse would never see. And if that second ledger was real, then the county's official history was only half the story.
There is a moment in every investigation when curiosity stops being harmless, when a man realizes the question he is asking might not want to be answered. George Harwick crossed that line the night he studied the map again. The courthouse was empty, the lamps burned low. Outside, Greer's Mill slept under the heavy silence of the mountains. Inside the clerk's office, the wall map had become something else entirely. Not a map, a pattern. Pins marked every birth where the name Nora Vance appeared. Red ink circles connected them. At first glance, it looked random. Scattered farms, isolated hollows, ridges that rarely saw travelers. But patterns reveal themselves slowly if you stare long enough. Harwick stepped back. Then he saw it. The births followed a path, not perfectly, not mechanically, but deliberately enough to notice. A slow movement across the county, north one year, south the next, then back toward the center, like someone walking the land, decade after decade, watching, witnessing, recording. And something else became obvious.
The farms where she appeared were not the poorest farms, nor the wealthiest. They were the oldest. Families whose names had existed in the county since before the courthouse itself was built. Lineages tied to land older than any written deed. Harwick felt a creeping awareness forming in his mind. If the Vance woman attended births among those families, then she wasn't just a midwife. She was present at the beginning of every bloodline that mattered. That realization stayed with him long after he locked the courthouse that night. But something else happened the following week, something that changed the nature of the mystery. A letter arrived. The handwriting belonged to a clerk from the neighboring county, a man named Elias Peel. Harwick had written to him weeks earlier, asking a simple question. Had the name Nora Vance ever appeared in their birth records? The response was short, but it carried weight. Yes, 6 times, between 1843 and 1867. Harwick read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. 6 births, same name, same witness column, in a county separated by a mountain ridge. Meaning the woman wasn't confined to Aldermore County. She crossed the mountains, moved between jurisdictions, appeared wherever certain families gave birth. Harwick immediately wrote back. He asked if Peel knew anything about the Vance family, where they lived, how old the woman might be, who her relatives were. Weeks passed, no reply. Harwick wrote again, still nothing. Then one morning in early autumn, a sealed envelope returned to the courthouse. His letter, unopened, stamped with a short note. Recipient no longer at address. That was unusual. County clerks didn't disappear. Their work tied them to public office. Harwick made inquiries through traveling merchants and court officials. The story that came back unsettled him deeply. Elias Peel had resigned suddenly, packed his household, moved his family north. No explanation. Neighbors described something strange about his final weeks. He had grown nervous, restless, often staring toward windows during conversations, like a man expecting someone to appear or afraid someone already had. One neighbor reported hearing Peel say something late one night on his porch, a sentence no one could explain. Some records should never be compared. When Harwick heard that story, he sat alone in the courthouse office for nearly an hour, because the implication was clear. The moment Peel looked for Nora Vance in his own records, something changed. Maybe he found more than 6 entries. Maybe he saw the same pattern Harwick had seen. Or maybe someone else noticed he had started looking. Harwick walked to the birth ledger again. He opened it slowly. The familiar pages whispered under his fingers. There it was. The name, again and again. Nora Vance. Suddenly the records felt different, not historical, not archival, alive, like a message left behind for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to read it. Harwick realized something then. If the Vance woman moved across counties for decades, if clerks who asked about her suddenly left their positions, if families avoided speaking her name, then this mystery wasn't local. It was structural, a system, a quiet agreement older than the courthouse itself. And systems like that don't exist without purpose, which meant the real question wasn't who Nora Vance was. The real question was what she was recording.
By the spring of 1880, the clerk had stopped sleeping well. At first, it was curiosity, then unease. Now it was something worse, because the more records he checked, the clearer the pattern became. The mysterious witness wasn't just present at births. She appeared only at certain births. Not every family, not every child, only specific ones. And when he mapped the names of those children, another pattern emerged. Their families owned land, not small plots, large farms, railroad-adjacent property, river crossings, mill sites, places that would become valuable decades later. The clerk didn't yet know why, but somehow the woman's presence lined up with future power.
Children whose births she witnessed would later become mayors, judges, bank directors, railroad investors, county commissioners. It looked less like coincidence and more like selection. And that realization changed the entire question, because suddenly the clerk wasn't asking, "Who is this woman?" He was asking something far more dangerous. Why was she there? Then another discovery shook him even more. On several records, the child's father listed in the ledger didn't match other documents: tax filings, land deeds, marriage records. In a few cases, the supposed father had been out of the county when the child was conceived, yet the birth certificate never changed. The official father remained the same, signed, witnessed, certified by the same woman. The clerk now faced a possibility he didn't want to believe. The witness might not have been confirming births. She might have been legitimizing identities, quietly, legally, permanently. And if that were true, those records weren't documenting families, they were manufacturing them. For the first time, the clerk began wondering if the courthouse records weren't simply flawed. What if they were designed to place certain children into certain bloodlines, to ensure land stayed inside particular families, to make inheritance uncontestable? Because once a birth was recorded, the law accepted it, courts relied on it, banks trusted it, history followed it. One signature could reshape generations. But the most disturbing clue appeared in a ledger from 1843, a birth in the Northern District. Mother, age 19. Father, local farmer. Witness, the same woman. But beside the entry, in faint pencil, someone had written a note later erased. The clerk held the page against the window light to read it, and the half-visible words made his stomach drop. It didn't say midwife. It didn't say witness. It said something else. A title, one used in certain private societies in the 1800s. A role that existed quietly, inside networks of influence. The word looked like registrar. Not a government registrar, a family registrar. Someone responsible for maintaining genealogies, ensuring bloodlines were recorded correctly, and correcting them when necessary. Which meant the mysterious woman might not have been a midwife at all. She might have been something far older, a guardian of lineage, someone ensuring that certain family lines continued exactly as planned. But one final question haunted the clerk most of all. Because if she had been active for 42 years, she would have been elderly, possibly in her 70s, maybe older. Yet no one ever described an old woman. Whenever he pushed witnesses harder, the answers became strangely inconsistent. Some remembered her as young, others said middle-aged. A few insisted she had black hair, others remembered gray, almost as if the person they saw was never exactly the same. And that possibility led to the thought the clerk refused to write down. What if the name wasn't a person? What if it was a role? Passed down, protected, replaced quietly whenever necessary. One registrar retiring, another stepping into the name. The records would stay the same, the public would never know, and the system would continue untouched, generation after generation. But if that theory was true, it meant the clerk wasn't investigating a woman. He was investigating an organization, one that had been quietly shaping family lines in the county for nearly half a century. And organizations that powerful rarely appreciate being discovered. Because by the end of that summer, someone else in town had realized exactly what the clerk was doing.
The first warning didn't feel like a threat. Not at first. It came disguised as politeness. One afternoon in late August 1880, the clerk returned to his office after lunch and found something unusual waiting on his desk. A letter. No seal, no return address, just a folded sheet of thick paper. Inside, written in careful ink, were only 2 sentences. County records are meant to preserve stability. Curiosity can sometimes damage what stability protects. No signature, no explanation, just that. The clerk stared at it for a long time because whoever wrote it knew exactly what he had been studying, and that meant something deeply uncomfortable. He had told no one about the witness name, not the sheriff, not the judge, not even the other clerks. He had been working alone, which left only two possibilities. Someone had been watching him, or someone had access to the records before he did. Neither possibility was comforting. He ignored the warning, at least at first, because curiosity is a difficult thing to turn off once it's fully awake. Instead of stopping, he did something riskier. He started copying entries. Late at night, after the courthouse closed, page numbers, names, dates. Every birth where the mysterious witness appeared. He wrote them all into a private notebook. If anything happened to the records, he wanted proof the pattern existed. 3 weeks later, something happened that made the warning feel far less polite. One of the ledgers disappeared. Not misplaced, not shelved wrong, gone. The book covering births from 1852 to 1856 simply vanished from the archive room. The clerk searched everywhere: storage cabinets, clerk desks, even the basement where damaged records were sometimes moved. Nothing. When he reported it, the response from the county supervisor was strangely calm, almost rehearsed. "Old records go missing sometimes," the supervisor said. "Paper deteriorates, pages fall apart. Best not worry about it." But the clerk knew something important. That particular ledger contained 9 entries with the mysterious witness name, and now those entries were gone. That night, he opened his notebook and checked something. Yes, he had copied those 9 births already, which meant whoever removed the ledger didn't know he had made a record. And for the first time, the clerk realized something chilling. The people protecting the system weren't perfect. They were careful, but not perfect. So he pushed further. Instead of just studying births, he began checking inheritance records, probate files, estate transfers, land succession. And once again, the pattern surfaced. Children whose births were witnessed by the mysterious registrar later inherited land in remarkably consistent ways. Property rarely left their bloodlines, even when debts piled up, even during bad harvest years, even when neighboring farms collapsed financially. Those families somehow kept their land, protected by legal structures that seemed unusually precise: trusts, guardianships, marriage agreements, documents that ensured land stayed inside specific circles, almost like someone had planned it generations earlier. Then the clerk noticed something else, something even more unsettling. Some of those powerful families weren't originally from the county. They appeared suddenly. A new settler arrives, buys land, has children, the mysterious witness appears on the birth record, and within 2 generations, that family sits on the county council, or controls the bank, or runs the railway office, as if someone had quietly planted them there. By October, the clerk had filled nearly half his notebook, and he had also begun noticing something else. People in town were watching him differently. Conversation stopped when he entered rooms. Strangers lingered near the courthouse steps. Once, walking home after dark, he heard footsteps behind him that stopped whenever he turned around. Nothing direct, nothing obvious, just small reminders that his investigation was no longer private. Then came the moment that finally made him realize how deep the system ran. It happened during a routine records request. A man he'd never seen before entered the courthouse one morning, well-dressed, calm, confident in a way that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned. He asked for access to birth ledgers from the 1840s, specifically the exact books the clerk had been studying. When the clerk asked why, the man smiled politely. "Genealogy," he said. "Family history. But when the clerk brought out the ledgers, the stranger didn't open them. He simply looked at the clerk and said something quietly, something that froze the air between them. "Some family histories," the man said, "are not meant to be rewritten." Then he left, without touching a single page. That night, the clerk returned home and opened his notebook again. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. Not who the registrar was, not why the system existed, but something much more dangerous. How far did it reach? Because if powerful families had been placed in the county intentionally, if birth records had been adjusted to secure bloodlines, if an organization had controlled lineage for decades, then the courthouse ledger wasn't the beginning of the story. It was only a small piece, and the truth might extend far beyond one county, possibly far beyond the state itself. But the clerk was about to discover something even worse, because the next ledger he opened contained a birth record that made his hand start to shake. The child listed on that page would one day become the most powerful man in the entire region, and once again, the witness line contained the same name.
The ledger was dated March 1849. At first glance, the entry looked completely ordinary. Mother's name, father's name, location of birth, a farmhouse just outside the western district of the county. But the child's name made the clerk pause, because he knew it immediately. Everyone in the county did. By 1880, that boy had grown into a man who controlled nearly half the region's rail contracts. He had served as state senator. He financed mills, roads, and banks. Newspapers called him the architect of the county's prosperity. And yet, sitting there in the birth ledger was the same familiar line. Witness, the same mysterious registrar, the same name, written in the same careful handwriting. The clerk felt something cold move through his stomach, because this wasn't a minor farmer's child. This was the birth record of the most powerful political figure the county had ever produced, which meant the system he had been uncovering didn't just influence landowners. It touched politics, money, infrastructure, power itself. And suddenly every strange pattern he'd noticed made more sense. Why certain families always seemed to rise, why land rarely left specific hands, why influence clustered around particular bloodlines. If the registrar truly controlled which births were legitimized, then she, or the organization behind her, had been quietly shaping the future leadership of the county for decades. But the clerk wasn't done reading, and the deeper he studied the entry, the stranger it became. Because something about the page was different. The handwriting, not the registrar's signature, that was identical to every other record. But the father's name had been corrected, originally written in darker ink, then crossed out, rewritten above it in a slightly lighter shade, officially corrected, legally accepted. But the correction mark looked hurried, as if it had been changed after the ledger was first completed. The clerk compared it to the probate records for that same family, and what he found made the situation far more disturbing. The man listed as the father in the corrected version had not married the mother until 8 months after the birth, which meant, legally speaking, at the time of the child's arrival, he wasn't the husband. Yet the record made it appear as if the child had been born into the marriage, perfectly legitimate, no scandal, no questions, just a clean lineage, certified, witnessed, final. The clerk leaned back in his chair, because now the pieces were aligning in a way that felt deliberate. If the original father had been someone else, someone less respectable, someone without property or influence, then correcting the record would accomplish something powerful. It would place the child inside a wealthy bloodline, secure inheritance, secure legitimacy, secure social standing, all with a single change in the ledger. and the registrar had been there to approve it. But the most unsettling discovery came when the clerk examined the margin notes. Most pages in the ledger were clean, just the standard entries. But beside this birth record, in extremely faint pencil, there was another annotation, one nearly invisible unless light hit it at the right angle. The clerk tilted the page toward the window, and slowly, carefully, the words appeared. Not a sentence, just two letters, C.P. At first they meant nothing, but the clerk had seen those initials somewhere else, not in the birth records, in something older, something stored in a locked cabinet in the courthouse basement. A set of documents most clerks never bothered reading because they weren't about births. They were about property charters. And those same initials appeared repeatedly on early land agreements signed decades earlier, always in the same small script, always beside approvals that allowed certain families to acquire land under unusual terms. The clerk suddenly understood something terrifying. The registrar wasn't just involved in births. She, or the organization behind her, was connected to property allocation as well. Land, bloodlines, inheritance, power, all tied together. And if those initials meant what he suspected they meant, then the system he had been uncovering wasn't local at all. It was part of something much older, something designed to quietly shape communities from the moment children were born. The clerk closed the ledger slowly, because now he realized the investigation had crossed an invisible boundary. Before, he had been studying a mystery. Now he was studying a structure of control, one that operated through records people trusted without question. Birth certificates, marriage documents, property deeds, the very documents that defined identity and ownership in the eyes of the law. And if those records could be quietly adjusted, then entire family histories could be rewritten without anyone realizing it. That night, the clerk returned to the courthouse after everyone had gone home. He unlocked the basement archive, lit a single oil lamp, and opened the cabinet containing the old property charters. He didn't know exactly what he would find, but he knew what he was looking for. Those two initials, C.P. If they appeared again, then the registrar's influence extended far beyond birth records. And if the pattern continued, it would prove something that would terrify anyone who understood the implications, because it would mean that for nearly a century, someone had been quietly designing who owned the county, who inherited its wealth, and possibly who ruled it. But the first charter he opened contained something that made his pulse race, because beside the signature approving the land transfer were those same two letters, written decades earlier, long before the mysterious registrar's name ever appeared in the birth ledger, which meant the system hadn't begun with her. She had inherited it, and whatever organization controlled it had been operating in the shadows for far longer than anyone in the courthouse realized.
The basement archive smelled like dust, oil, and old paper. Most clerks avoided it. Decades of forgotten files sat in wooden cabinets that hadn't been reorganized since the Civil War. Property charters, boundary disputes, early settlement contracts. But that night, the clerk wasn't searching randomly. He was hunting for two small letters, C.P. He opened the first charter dated 1821. There they were. Not in the main text, not in the official signature, but in the margin, small, neat, almost like a private confirmation mark. The document approved the transfer of a large tract of riverland to a newly arrived family. A family that, the clerk realized, still owned 3 mills in the county. He opened another, 1827, another land transfer, another family that would later become wealthy, and again the same initials, C.P. At first it seemed like coincidence, but then he opened a third, 1833. Same pattern, different land, different family,
same initials. And suddenly the realization hit him with uncomfortable clarity. These weren't random approvals. They were selections. Someone had quietly marked which families would receive valuable land decades before their children were even born. And that meant something chilling, because the registrar who appeared in the birth records starting in the late 1830s was continuing the same pattern. Land first, bloodlines later. A two-stage system. Step 1, place families in positions of opportunity. Step 2, control the legitimacy of their heirs. Together, those two mechanisms could shape the leadership of an entire region without ever appearing in public. No elections manipulated, no laws broken, just paperwork, quietly adjusted, quietly approved. The clerk kept searching, and the deeper he dug, the stranger the pattern became. Some families received large land grants, but their children's births were never witnessed by the registrar. Those families eventually faded. Farms sold, businesses failed, influence disappeared within a generation. But the families whose births did receive the registrar's signature, they prospered, almost uncannily. Even when they made bad decisions, even when harvests failed, even when economic crashes ruined neighboring farmers, they survived. Their land remained intact. Their influence grew. It was almost as if someone was protecting certain bloodlines while quietly letting others fall away. And the clerk began wondering something even darker. Maybe the registrar wasn't creating powerful families. Maybe she was identifying them, tracking them, ensuring that certain genetic lines continued while others slowly disappeared from the county's leadership. Hours passed. The oil lamp burned lower, and the clerk eventually found the oldest charter in the cabinet, a document dated 1812, older than the courthouse itself. The paper had yellowed with age, and the ink had faded in places, but the approval mark in the margin was still visible, those same two letters, CP, which meant the system had been operating for at least 68 years, possibly longer, long before the mysterious registrar ever appeared in the birth records. The clerk leaned back slowly, because that changed the scale of everything. He had assumed he was uncovering a local conspiracy, something confined to the county, but systems that last 70 years rarely exist in isolation. They have structure, hierarchy, continuity, which meant someone had trained the registrar, someone had maintained the records, someone had decided which families were selected, and those decisions likely weren't being made in a small rural courthouse. Then he noticed something on the back of the 1812 charter, a seal, faded but still visible. Not a county seal, not a state seal, something older, a circular emblem pressed into the wax. Inside the circle were several symbols the clerk didn't recognize, but the outer ring contained words written in Latin. The clerk wasn't fluent, but he knew enough to translate the final line. And when he whispered the phrase aloud, a chill moved through the quiet basement. The inscription read, Custodes Prosapi, Guardians of the Bloodline. Suddenly the initials made sense. CP. Not a person, not a clerk, not even a registrar, but an organization, ones whose entire purpose appeared to be preserving specific family lines, quietly shaping communities through land ownership, marriage legitimacy, and inheritance. The registrar wasn't the architect. She was just the local representative, one agent inside a much larger network. The clerk closed the cabinet. For the first time since the investigation began, fear replaced curiosity completely. Because if this organization had been operating for decades, possibly centuries, then people far more powerful than a county clerk had an interest in keeping it invisible. And by documenting the pattern in his notebook, he had just placed himself directly in its path. When he finally left the courthouse that night, the town was silent. No lamps in the streets, no wagons moving, just the sound of his own footsteps on the dirt road. But halfway home, he noticed something that made him stop walking. Light. Inside his house, a lamp glowing through the front window. The clerk was certain of one thing. When he had left the courthouse hours earlier, he had extinguished every flame, which meant someone was waiting for him inside, and whoever it was already knew about the notebook.
The clerk stood in the road for nearly a full minute. The lamp inside his house flickered softly behind the curtains. Someone had lit it recently. He was certain of that. He considered turning around, walking back to the courthouse, finding the sheriff, but something told him that would be pointless. If the system he had uncovered truly stretched beyond the county, the sheriff would be powerless, or worse, already aware. So the clerk did the only thing curiosity had trained him to do. He walked toward the house, slowly. The front door was unlocked, another detail that made his chest tighten. He never left it that way. Inside, the small oil lamp on the table illuminated the room just enough to reveal a single figure seated in the chair beside it. A man, middle-aged, well-dressed in a dark coat that looked expensive but deliberately plain. The stranger didn't move when the clerk stepped inside. He simply watched him, calm, almost patient. "You've been very busy," the man said quietly. The clerk didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the desk where he kept his papers. The notebook was gone. The man noticed. "You're looking for this." He placed the clerk's notebook gently on the table, not open, not damaged, just resting there, as if it had been borrowed. "Who are you?" the clerk finally asked. The man smiled faintly. "Someone tasked with maintaining stability." The same word from the warning letter, stability. The stranger opened the notebook slowly, page after page of copied birth entries, dates, names, the registrar's signature repeated dozens of times. "You're very thorough," the man said. "Most clerks never notice patterns like this." "That woman, the registrar, who is she?" The man leaned back in the chair. "For the sake of accuracy," he said, "there has been more than one." So the theory was true. The name was a title, a position passed from one person to another, guardianship of the records, guardianship of the bloodlines. "You're part of this," the clerk said. The man didn't deny it. Instead, he gestured toward the notebook. "You've already figured out most of it. Land placement, lineage verification, generational continuity." "Why?" the clerk asked. The man studied him for a moment. "Because societies require structure, and structure requires foresight." He tapped one of the pages, a birth record the clerk had copied earlier. "One child placed into the correct family can shape 50 years of local leadership." Another. 2 generations later, that child's descendants run banks, railroads, courts." Another. "Communities remain stable, predictable, governable." The clerk felt anger rise in his chest. "You're deciding who runs the world," he said. The man shook his head slightly. "No, we're ensuring the world is run by people capable of maintaining order." The silence that followed felt heavy, because the clerk suddenly understood something terrible. The man believed what he was saying, completely. This wasn't corruption in his mind, it was management. "And the families who aren't selected?" the clerk asked. The man closed the notebook. "History always contains more people than positions of influence," he said calmly. "Not every lineage can lead." The clerk stared at him. "You're rewriting reality." The man tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "we're curating it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the clerk asked the question that had been haunting him since the basement discovery. "How far does it go?" The man's faint smile returned. "Farther than you'd believe." He stood up slowly, buttoned his coat, and slid the notebook across the table toward the clerk.
We won't be taking this." The clerk blinked in surprise. "You're letting me keep it?" "Of course," the man said. "Discoveries like yours happen occasionally." That answer felt wrong, too easy. "Then why come here at all?" the clerk asked. The man walked toward the door. Before leaving, he looked back once, to ask a simple question. He paused, studying the clerk carefully. "You now know how the system works. You know how many families depend on it. You know how much stability it provides." Then the stranger asked the question quietly, the question that would decide everything. "So tell me, clerk, are you planning to expose it?" The oil lamp crackled softly in the silence, because the clerk understood something in that moment. The man wasn't threatening him, not directly. He was offering a choice: expose the truth and destabilize generations of power, or remain silent and allow the invisible system to continue shaping the future. But what the clerk didn't yet realize was that the decision had already been made long before that night, and not by him, because earlier that evening, someone else had already opened the archive, someone who had taken one very specific document, the oldest charter, the one bearing the seal of the Custodes Praesapiae, and by sunrise the next morning, the clerk's entire investigation would take a turn he never saw coming.
The night pressed in around the courthouse like a living thing. Somewhere in the shadows, a door creaked softly. The clerk froze, his heartbeat loud in his ears. But when he turned, the hallway was empty. The notebook lay on the table, unopened, as if daring him to act. By the first gray light of morning, the clerk had made a decision. He would return to the archive. He had to see the original documents, the ones the stranger hadn't taken. Every detail, every signature, every seal. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust as he approached the archive, but the room was not as he had left it. Drawers were open, papers scattered. One document was missing. Not just any document, the oldest charter, the one tied to the Custodes Praesapiae. Panic clawed at him. Who else knew about this? Had the stranger returned, or was it someone entirely different? He noticed subtle changes, marks on the floor, a faint smudge on the ledger, a chair slightly out of place. Someone had been there, and quickly. Deliberate, silent, efficient. The clerk's thoughts raced. If the charter was gone, then someone now controlled the origin of the entire system. Not him, not the stranger, someone else. He rifled through the remaining documents looking for clues. Annotations in the margins, faint fingerprints pressed into the old wax seals. Every detail told a story, but the story was incomplete. He remembered the stranger's words. "So tell me, clerk, are you planning to expose it?" The weight of that choice pressed on him now heavier than ever, because exposure without the charter, without proof, would be meaningless. And yet, silence felt like complicity. Suddenly, a faint noise, a drawer sliding shut somewhere in the courthouse, made him freeze. The clerk realized he was not alone. Someone was watching, waiting, and they had already moved faster than he could anticipate. The morning light spilled into the hallway. He stepped out, notebook clutched tightly, and scanned the empty corridors. The courthouse seemed ordinary, but he knew better. Every surface, every document, every shadow carried the weight of centuries of unseen control. And in that moment, the clerk understood a terrifying truth. The system wasn't just in the documents, it was everywhere. And he was just a single observer in a web far larger than he could ever hope to untangle. A whisper of wind rustled the papers on the table. The clerk shivered, because he knew one thing for certain. By the end of the day, nothing would be the same, and the missing charter was only the beginning. He followed the trail. Not a visible one. There were no footprints, no torn paper, no note left behind, but a trail of subtle absences. A missing candle stub, a ledger slightly ajar,
A chair moved at an odd angle. Small, almost imperceptible shifts that told him someone had been here, and someone was always careful to erase their presence afterward. The clerk's mind raced. Who could navigate these records with such precision? Someone who knew the courthouse as intimately as he did, or someone who had studied it for years, waiting for the right moment? And then the realization hit. It wasn't random, not theft, not curiosity. This was deliberate preparation. Every movement, every erased mark, every shadowed corner, it was all orchestrated to guide him toward a single, inevitable discovery. He paused at the doorway to the archive. His fingers hovered over the doorknob. He wanted to call out, to announce himself to anyone hiding within, but something held him back. The air felt thick, almost electric, as if the room itself was alive with attention. Inside, the remaining ledgers seemed ordinary, yet the clerk knew better. Every entry, every name, every marginal note could conceal decades of orchestrated influence, hidden debts, and unspoken authority. His eyes were drawn to the faint smudge in the corner of one page, almost imperceptible, but it was deliberate. He leaned closer. A name, faintly inscribed, almost erased. Vance. Not Nora Vance, not the name from the official records, just Vance. The clerk's breath caught. The room felt suddenly smaller, the shadows longer. He had been told there were parallel records, but this was something else entirely, something older, something fundamental. His heart pounded as he realized the ledger he held was not just an account of births. It was a map of control, of influence, of silent power maintained over generations. Every name, every entry, every omission was a thread in a web designed to manipulate reality itself. He ran his hand over the page again, feeling the indents of the pen. The marks were decades old, but the force behind them, the intention, it was alive. It spoke to him in silence, in absence, in the spaces between ink and paper. And then he understood. Someone, or something, had been shaping this county long before any official records existed, before the courthouse, before the maps, before law itself. A presence, patient, deliberate, omnipresent. He stepped back, his mind spinning. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in ways that defied logic. And for the first time, he realized this was no longer about curiosity, no longer about uncovering the past. It was about surviving knowledge. Because once you see it, once you understand the mechanics of hidden power, there is no turning back. And the ledger, the missing charter, the whispers in the hallways, they were all warning him. Some truths are protected. Some knowledge is dangerous. Outside, the wind rattled the courthouse windows. A branch scraped against the wall like fingernails. The clerk knew one thing with clarity. Someone had designed every obstacle, every record, every ledger to test those who dared look too closely. And now he had passed the test. The question remained, what would the guardians of this hidden architecture allow him to do next?
The next morning, he rode back toward the eastern hollow with a weight pressing down on his chest, heavier than any saddle could carry. Every tree seemed to lean closer, whispering secrets he wasn't yet ready to hear. The path, already narrow and rugged, now felt like a gauntlet. Every turn, every fallen branch, every shadow seemed deliberate, as if guiding him, warning him, testing him. He had been told by older farmers that a woman lived at the far end of the hollow. Some spoke her name in hushed tones, others avoided the subject entirely, and a few, with eyes hard and distant, hinted she was something more than human, an institution unto herself. By the time he reached the small clearing where the cabin should have been, his hands were trembling, not from fatigue, but from the anticipation of seeing a living embodiment of decades of concealed power.
The cabin appeared exactly as described: 2 rooms, aged timber, blackened by time. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, defying the late morning sun. The place radiated stillness, not neglect, but intention. He dismounted slowly, every instinct screaming caution. Then the door opened. She stood there, not old, not withered, not frail, an impossibility, a person who had weathered decades without the expected decay. Her eyes were dark, penetrating, calm, yet they seemed to see straight through him, weighing the entirety of his motives. She did not ask who he was. She did not hesitate. She simply said, "You know why you are here." His mind raced. How could she know? How could anyone know? And yet the certainty in her tone left no room for doubt. The air between them was electric, silent, filled with a knowledge older than the courthouse ledgers, older than the county itself. He stepped closer, aware that every move was being measured, calculated. "I need to understand," he said, his voice steady but low, "why the Vance name appears in every record. For 40 years, one name, one witness, one presence, everywhere, always." She nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "Because someone has to know," she said, plain, deliberate, not a riddle, not a threat, just fact. He swallowed. "Know what?" She studied him for a long moment. Everything. The deaths, the arrangements, the conditions under which every family lives and dies, the things the county ledger will never record, the things that hold the world of this hollow together. It was then he realized the depth of the secret. The ledger, the births, the witness column, it was a veil. It was less about documentation than control, less about law than architecture, and she, Nora Vance, was both the guardian and the executor, the living proof that the order of this county was maintained quietly, invisibly, deliberately, for generations. He stepped forward, compelled but wary. "And the others?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Who came before you? Who will come after?" She smiled faintly. "Some things are bigger than any one person. The ledger will continue. The record will remain. And those who know will act when necessary. Others will forget, as you will if you wish to survive what you now understand." The sun shifted. Shadows lengthened across the clearing. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, a responsibility he had not chosen, a knowledge he could never unlearn. And yet, in that moment, he knew he was part of something far older than law, older than power, older than memory itself. Because the Vance name was more than a name. It was a presence, a force, a hidden hand shaping every life it touched. And he was standing directly in its path.
The cabin's interior was deceptively simple. A small kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a single table scarred with decades of use, and shelves lined with jars of herbs, powders, and tightly bound books. But it was the far wall that drew him in, a single, unassuming cabinet, its doors locked with a heavy iron clasp. She gestured toward it. "Everything you want to know is in there," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of centuries. "But be warned, knowledge is a burden, and once you see, you cannot look away." He hesitated, heart hammering. His fingers brushed the iron clasp, cold and immovable, yet the air around it seemed to hum. The sense of inevitability was overwhelming. He had come this far, through rumors, forests, and decades of whispered secrets, only to stand before the core of it all. "I need to understand," he said again, more to himself than to her. "I need to see the ledger." She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "Then see it," she said. Slowly, deliberately, she unlocked the clasp with a key that seemed almost too ornate for this cabin. The doors creaked open, revealing stacks of meticulously maintained ledgers, bound in leather worn soft by constant handling. The edges were gilded, and the pages were filled with a script that was both elegant and precise. He ran a hand over the topmost book, feeling the weight of centuries beneath his fingertips. Opening it, he saw names, dates, and entries that seemed ordinary at first glance, but then the patterns emerged. Every Vance witness was noted, always present, always observing, always silently influencing. But there were other annotations, symbols, marks, small diagrams that suggested a network of control far beyond mere record-keeping. "This isn't a ledger," he whispered. "It's a map." She nodded. "Of influence, of responsibility, of those who maintain the balance. Every name is a node, every act recorded, every outcome anticipated." His mind reeled. He traced the lines connecting families, businesses, and land. The ledger was alive, in a sense, an architecture of power, a living web that shaped the county without ever being seen. And at the center of it all, always, was the Vance name. "You understand now," she said, watching him carefully. "You see why I remain, because someone must know. Someone must act, and sometimes someone must choose who will survive and who will not." He closed the ledger, trembling, his vision blurred with the enormity of the revelation. "And me?" he asked. "Why am I here? Why show me this?" "Because the ledger has chosen," she said simply. "It always chooses, and now it has chosen you." The sun had sunk lower in the sky, shadows creeping along the floorboards. He realized in that moment that the hollow he had wandered into was not just a place. It was a test, a living chronicle, and he was now irrevocably bound to its purpose. He could step back, walk away, pretend he had never seen, but he knew, deep down, that ignorance was no longer an option. Once the ledger revealed itself, once the Vance presence acknowledged him, there was no turning back. And so he made a silent vow to understand, to endure, to see the ledger through, no matter the cost. Because in the Eastern Hollow, knowledge was not just power, it was survival. The moment he stepped out of the cabin, the forest seemed different, denser, heavier, almost aware. The creek babbled quietly below, but its sound carried an undertone, like a warning. The weight of what he had seen pressed on him, a pressure that made each step toward the path feel deliberate, ritualistic, as though he were walking a boundary between the world of ordinary men and the world of those who knew the ledger's secrets. He returned to the courthouse with a mind racing, heart pounding in a rhythm that refused calm. The ledger had revealed itself, yes, but it had also revealed him. And with revelation came responsibility. Not the kind the county expected from its clerks, the kind that involved signing forms and recording births, deaths, and deeds. This was responsibility of a darker, older order. The ledger did not forgive hesitation, nor did it tolerate ignorance. That night, alone in his office, Harwick pored over the county ledgers once more. He compared them with what he remembered of the Vance ledger, reconstructing its invisible threads from memory, speculation, and the fragments of knowledge he had absorbed. The patterns were clear. Families, lands, marriages, debts, all intertwined in a lattice of obligation and quiet power. And at the center of that lattice, always the Vance name. He realized that the ledger's architecture was not static. It shifted subtly, responding to the actions of those it recorded. Decisions made in 1 year rippled decades forward, influencing who held land, who married whom, who owed what, and who survived.
The Vance women had been the custodians of this system for generations, unseen arbiters of fate in a county that believed itself simple, isolated, and self-governing. But now he was inside the web. He could see it, and with vision came temptation. Already possibilities swirled in his mind. He could correct the records. He could expose errors, redistribute influence, perhaps even topple centuries of unspoken hierarchies. Or he could do nothing, maintain the balance, preserve the fragile order that had sustained the county for generations. And then he understood. This was the ledger's first test. It did not demand action, it demanded recognition of choice, and choice, once seen, could never be undone. He thought back to her words in the cabin. Someone must choose who will survive and who will not. The phrase echoed in his mind, a cadence of inevitability. The ledger was not merely a book, it was a living instrument of power, and he was now its operator, whether he wished it or not. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees like voices he had not heard before. Shadows deepened in the corners of the courthouse office. He could feel them watching, waiting, judging. The ledger had selected him, and now it demanded he define himself through action or inaction. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The decision would come soon, and when it did, it would not only define the county's future, it would define him. Because in this place, in the Eastern Hollow and its surrounding hills, knowledge was not just power, knowledge was a burden, and the ledger, eternal, patient, and precise, never let go.
The following weeks were marked by a new kind of vigilance. Harwick moved through the courthouse with a quiet, almost ritualistic precision, as if every step might disturb the delicate balance he had glimpsed. Clerical work had always been predictable, a matter of routine and order. Now, each ledger entry, each name, each date carried weight, implication, and consequence. Even a single miswritten figure could cascade through decades of unrecorded arrangements. He began to notice the subtle signals in the courthouse, the way certain men lingered by the ledgers, their glances too long, their hands brushing the pages as if searching for something they already knew. Farmers came and went with an air of deliberate avoidance, steering conversations away from particular families, particular years. Women entering to pay taxes spoke in clipped tones, careful to avoid certain phrases. Harwick had seen these behaviors before in minor ways, but now, in the light of what he knew, they carried a new significance. Every gesture was a thread in a web of control, carefully maintained for decades. It became clear that the ledger's influence extended beyond the pages. Decisions in the courthouse, who received credit at the store, who was trusted with land agreements, who was quietly excluded from disputes, were shaped by invisible guidance, an architecture of social order that had been maintained by the Vance women for generations. And yet the ledger itself was not entirely benevolent. It carried consequences for those who ignored its presence. Families that had tried to bypass the system, even in small ways, had suffered setbacks, losses, or unexplained misfortune. Harwick understood that he was standing at a crossroads. He could continue to perform the routine duties expected of him, recording births and deaths without question, keeping the surface calm and orderly. Or he could explore the ledger's deeper truths, seeking to understand the power dynamics hidden in the Vance system, perhaps even to influence them. But every action or inaction was consequential. Late one evening, Harwick found himself alone in the dim light of the courthouse. The ledger lay open before him, its pages yellowed but immaculate, the familiar ink of Howard Cutter still crisp after decades. He traced the name Nora Vance, feeling the weight of its repeated presence. The woman had not been a simple midwife, nor merely a witness. She had been a nexus, a constant in a variable world,
orchestrating outcomes with knowledge and foresight beyond ordinary understanding. And then he noticed something he had not before, a pattern in the ledger that suggested more than simple observation, a subtle manipulation. Certain births, certain family connections, even the timing of registrations seemed designed to preserve advantage, to maintain the stability of influence among specific households. The ledger was not just a reflection of the community, it was an instrument of control. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He realized that this was the true danger. The ledger could not be destroyed, could not be ignored, and could not be revealed without consequence. It was a mechanism of power, silent, invisible, yet omnipresent. And now he was bound to it. In that moment, a cold clarity settled over him. The ledger was not merely a record, it was a system. And systems, once understood, demand compliance or mastery. The next section will confront Harwick with his first moral dilemma, where his curiosity collides with the ethical implications of revealing or concealing the hidden truths of the ledger.
Harwick's moral calculus began to unravel under the weight of the ledger's implications. Every decision he made now carried unseen consequences, not only for himself, but for entire families whose lives had been quietly guided or manipulated by a system they could never fully perceive. The Vance records were more than documents. They were instruments of social engineering, carefully maintained to protect, to reward, and sometimes to punish. Harwick understood that even a minor misstep could cascade through decades of accumulated influence, undoing carefully constructed arrangements with the force of inevitability. He started keeping a private journal, a second ledger of thought and observation. Each night he recorded what he had seen, who had reacted to what, the timing of inquiries, the way conversations shifted. Every entry was a map of subtle influence, a diagram of human behavior sculpted by knowledge and secrecy. The deeper he delved, the more he realized that the Vance system was not simply about attending births, it was about maintaining a hierarchy, an invisible governance operating parallel to official county authority. One evening, as the fire in the courthouse hearth flickered and shadows stretched across the worn floorboards, Harwick found himself questioning the ledger itself. Who had the authority to decide which family remained protected and which did not? How many generations had the Vance women shaped without ever being questioned, without any public record of their interventions? And more unsettling, who ensured that the ledger remained hidden from those who might exploit its power? The answers were not in the ink or the paper. They were in the subtle rhythms of the county, in the behaviors that had persisted unnoticed for decades. A letter arrived that evening, slipped under the courthouse door, unsigned but unmistakably deliberate. It read, "The ledger is not for your understanding, nor your interference. Some truths serve only stability. To disturb them is to endanger what you do not yet comprehend." Harwick held the note in his hands, feeling the weight of its warning. Someone knew he was probing too deeply. Someone was watching. And the ledger, he realized, had guardians, unspecified, unseen, but fully aware of the threads he was beginning to trace. He closed the ledger, letting it rest on the table, as if its mere presence might transmit knowledge into the air. Harwick understood then that his position was no longer just clerical. He had become a participant in a centuries-old system of surveillance, influence, and protection. Every encounter, every question, every glance in the courthouse was now part of a larger design. He could not retreat. He could not pretend ignorance. To ignore what he had discovered was itself a choice, and a dangerous one. Harwick spent the night turning the problem over in his mind, a slow rotation of possibilities and consequences.
He realized he could either attempt to map the entire system, risking exposure and disruption, or maintain a careful distance, preserving the existing order while observing. One choice promised knowledge, the other safety. But knowledge, he understood, was a compulsion impossible to resist. By dawn, he had made his decision. He would proceed, cautiously but deliberately. Every interaction would be an experiment, every observation a data point. He would attempt to understand the ledger's architecture, even if it meant confronting forces older and more deliberate than any county law. And somewhere, deep in the shadows of that courthouse, Harwick understood something chilling. The ledger was not just a record of the past, it was a blueprint for power, quiet, invisible, and enduring.
The Eastern Hollow lay beyond the town's familiar boundaries, a stretch of dense forest and abandoned homesteads that locals avoided in casual conversation. Harwick had passed its edge countless times, always aware of the stories, disappearances, strange lights, whispers in the night, but he had never ventured inward. Now, with the ledger's subtle insistence guiding him, he understood that the Hollow was more than a landscape of fear. It was a repository of the ledger's living influence, where the consequences of decisions long past took form in people, buildings, and secrets. He approached at dusk. The air was thick with mist, and the fading sunlight filtered through skeletal branches like fractured amber. The Hollow seemed to watch him. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf was amplified in his awareness. Harwick's journal was in his coat pocket, a portable ledger of his observations, and he could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest, not just paper, but the responsibility it carried. The first structure he encountered was a dilapidated farmhouse. Its windows were black voids, its walls sagging under decades of neglect. Yet as he circled the building, Harwick noticed anomalies, patterns in the cracked paint that resembled symbols, marks on the doorframe that aligned with dates and names he had seen in the ledger. The Vance influence, he realized, had physical footprints. The ledger wasn't just a book. It was encoded in space itself, in architecture, in the way humans interacted with it, often unconsciously. Suddenly, movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, indistinct at first, then clear, tall, deliberate in her pace, her eyes sharp and assessing. Harwick recognized the bearing immediately, the Vance lineage. She spoke without preamble. "You shouldn't be here." Harwick held up his journal. "I need to understand. I've been studying the ledger, its patterns, its influence. I can't unsee what I've learned." The woman's gaze didn't soften. "Knowledge has a price. Eastern Hollow isn't a library. It's a proving ground. The ledger guides, but it also tests. And some truths will not forgive mistakes." Harwick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The ledger had always been a document of oversight, of quiet, distant control. Here it became interactive, almost sentient. Every decision he made could ripple forward or snap backward. "You want proof?" she asked, her voice low, commanding. "Follow me." He trailed her through the overgrown path, past the remains of barns, wells, and gardens frozen in decay. Each site seemed ordinary at first glance, but revealed subtleties. A caretaker's mark etched into a beam, a pile of stones arranged to correspond with family names in the ledger, the lingering scent of herbs and smoke indicating rituals designed to protect, to signal, or to remember. Finally, they reached a clearing. At its center was a stone obelisk, carved with a labyrinthine network of symbols. Harwick recognized some immediately from the ledger. Others were unfamiliar, but clearly part of the same system. The woman gestured. "This is the heart of the Hollow.
Every decision recorded in the ledger converges here. It is the fulcrum of influence, the axis upon which the county's hidden order turns. Step carefully. Harwick stepped closer, feeling the stone's cold energy seeping into his hands. Patterns from the ledger seemed to shift under his gaze, almost responsive, as if the record itself were alive and aware of his presence. He realized, with a mixture of awe and dread, that understanding the ledger was no longer a matter of reading, it was a matter of interaction. And then he noticed it. A shadow moving along the edge of the clearing, a presence deliberate, watching him as closely as he watched the obelisk. The ledger had guardians here too, unseen but unmistakable. Harwick understood that he was now within a system far more immediate and dangerous than any courthouse record. He took a deep breath, clutching his journal. The Eastern Hollow had revealed itself not as a place of myth, but as a crucible. Every observation, every note, every choice from here on would shape the ledger's reality, and perhaps his own. The next section will explore the first test of the ledger, where Harwick confronts not only its guardians, but the moral weight of controlling knowledge that can alter lives.